on Friday. It's gonna be cold though, so make sure you're prepared. You're gonna be working on the dock, so it's just basically you're gonna be outside. You'll be in the boat for maybe half hour, so it does get windy and you can get cold there. So a windbreak is advisable. Even if it's not raining, rain gear protects you from the wind and cold, right? There's a few people said, I don't think they've been downtown Olympia, so I made copies of the maps. Who wants them? Okay, great, even more. These are in the slides for the lecture. And during the day today, as you're discussing, if you want to carpool or something, this is a good time to do that plan. Okay? Great. Okay, so that's about tomorrow. Then I'm going to pass a sign-up sheet as we should do for signing up for attendance. And then on the other side, please also sign up for a slot to give your popular media presentation. Right? 2 people already gave it, so I put their names already there for week 2. So Kelsey and Maven need to do it. So there's other slots for each of the weeks. There's a presentation in the morning and the afternoon, so you can sign up for either one. Okay. So let me pass. Sign the attendance and make sure you look at the second sheet. Sign up for a slot to give your popular media presentation. Okay. Now, let me talk about seminar. So we gave a model seminar last week. Today we're going to repeating a seminar led by the faculty. And then starting next week, we're going to start these rotations. So I just passed this handout that describes the rotations. So let me briefly tell you about them. And then I'm going to start by, I don't know where I left my sign-up sheet for the rotations. Yeah, but I had another sign-up sheet for this. Oh yeah, you're right, here it is. Okay, great. All right. So the way the rotation is going to be work is as follows. Actually, the faculty also is going to be rotating. You know, there's 2 of us, and we represent kind of different focus. We're reading 3 books, and each book is going to be covered over 2 weeks. So each of the books, you'll have one seminar with Shamila, one seminar with me, right? And so what is your rotation in your roles? Okay, so starting next seminar, half of you are going to write an essay. Okay, and I'll put instructions in Canvas as we did for this seminar with a prompt. So half of you are going to be writing an essay. And and then the next book is Under White Sky. I just read to half of the book, which is page 113. I also post it, but if you already have the books that are reading it, so half of the book's about page 113. So if you're writing an essay, what are you going to do? Well, there's 3 roles that are going to be covered, and students will rotate through those roles. So an assessment class is perfect, actually. So all of you will get to do all the 3 roles. So what are the roles? 2 of you are going to be facilitators. So we're modeling that yesterday, last week and today. And your facilitators, you'll get some help. So Sharmila and me, or both of us, will meet with you Tuesday after class to kind of help you if you have with your plan, your thoughts, and you come in with some ideas of what to do here. So you're not just okay. And as you'll see as the seminars progress, subsequent seminar facilitators can learn from what happened before. It's actually pretty fun. I think you'll enjoy it. 2 of you are going to be scribes. So a scribe is basically takes notes of what's going on the seminar, and at the end of the seminar, we'll kind of report out what they thought was some of the most interesting things they heard. The last one is quoters. So the people that are quoters essentially look through the reading and find quotes that are insightful, that provide some connection with the lecture material, something they thought was interesting, right? And that ensures if there's something specific they can convey. Okay? And then the following week, then everybody that had roles are the ones that write essays, and the people that wrote essays next week don't have an essay to write because they already wrote one for that book, and they'll be participating in those roles. That kind of make sense? Okay? So to facilitate it, it's quite small. Maybe I'll just ask for volunteers to people that want to be facilitators next week. Get out of the way. Okay, and Sophie?
Yeah.
Sophie, and then one more person?
I don't care.
I don't care.
Okay, and Ben?
Mm-hmm.
How about scribes? Two scribes. And Anastasia? Okay, and one more. And E. How about quotes? Okay, Anox. And Iris. So the rest of you have an essay to write. Okay? And then what I'll do, since I know this, I'm gonna write down what we're gonna do each week and I'll post it for you. Great? Okay? I think that's all I need to say for announcements of facilitators.
So, one more point about logistics. Next week's seminar is not going to happen on Wednesday at this time. It's going to happen on Friday during the social science workshop time, and that is because we are all going to be going to listen to a talk by an outside speaker whose name is Sarah Jacket Ray, and she used to be a colleague when I was doing my PhD in environmental studies at the University of Oregon, and now she recently just published a book on how to deal with climate anxiety. I think it's called Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. How many of you think that that subject is of interest or relevant? A lot of people, talk about the feelings ranging from climate anxiety to climate grief to eco-anxiety, eco-grief. It seems like there's a need for that kind of talk. And so the Center for Climate Action and Sustainability has invited her, and she's giving this talk from 11:30 to 1. And we will give you information about where the talk is going to be. It's probably going to be at a big lecture hall, in the lecture hall, in the same building where we do our lectures on Tuesday. So we'll give more information about that on Tuesday. And next, so the essay writers and the facilitators, scribes and all, so your work is going to be in preparation for the Friday seminar. So for that week, next week, we'll make the essay due before Friday. So it's just 2 of the weeks of the term. There's a somewhat unusual schedule. I think it's not a bad thing to have a few more days to write the essays. Okay, so for today's seminar, since we are sort of modeling various strategies for doing seminar discussion, last week we did some activities. So today I want us to take a close look at each of the articles, and so I've sort of come up with a plan to have a breakout group discussion looking into certain things. Let's first focus on Hardin, because the Hardin and Ostrom arguments sort of go hand in hand, because one group presented a really key influential idea and then the other has sort of critiqued it. So there's an argument and a counter-argument. However, this week the theme was looking at population issues, and Ostrom doesn't really say much about population control. So her work is not a critique of neo-Malthusian ideas, but rather of the idea of the commons. And Hardin does both. He is really focused on the question of population, but he's also then using the language of commons, whether or not he's using that term accurately. So there are 2 things going on in Hardin. So let's first focus on Hardin. We'll break up into sort of groups of 3 or 4 people, and I want each group to do this in a structured way. So we like to encourage people to really focus on unpacking the articles we are seminaring on, as opposed to picking up 1 or 2 main ideas and then launching off on a discussion that's not connected to the arguments in the reading. So to really focus our discussion on the reading, I want the groups, the breakout groups to first do this. So each person in the breakout group should take out your article, Hardin, the printout. If you don't have the printout, then I don't know, your screen where you have the article. And maybe spend a minute to review the article or so, or to remember what things from the article you would like to would like to talk about. So pick a quote, one quote that you would like to bring up for some brief discussion. So each person in the breakout brings one quote to share and says something about the quote. Did you find it strange, very interesting, or very compelling, or did it make sense? So for example, if I were to do this, I would, so something that I thought was interesting to talk about, on page 1245 of the Hardin article, on the leftmost, the first column, the last, second to last paragraph talks about national parks. So there's a quote about national parks and how it's open to everyone, and therefore it's a commons. And so maybe it's going to become damaged because there's too many people that might have access to the national parks. And so the best solution to address, to protect the national parks is to break it up into private property. So I found that to be a very startling idea that today wouldn't be seen as an environmentally conscious idea at all. So I would, say, this is a quote I marked and then have a conversation about it. So in each breakout group, I would like every person to bring one quote or excerpt that they would like to, share some thoughts about and then hear others. So that'll take a little bit of time. So first round, share quotes. Second round, maybe have a brief discussion. It doesn't have to be every person having a turn, but talk about what are the main arguments Hardin brings up. And then at the next step, talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of his claims. Not just the key argument, but he talks about a lot of things. Some of them are very, I think, compelling. Some of them are not as compelling. And so maybe have a conversation about that. And finally, I want you to talk about, in your breakout groups, what do you think of this article as a piece of, scientific thinking? Is this a scientific article, or what kind of an article is this? It is written by a scientist, but so think about the writing style, the way in which the argument has been built up, how compelling or convincing you find it, and also what methodology has been used to come up with these arguments and claims. So have that kind of discussion. You can take up to 20 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and have a broader discussion of the things that came up in your breakout groups. So do you guys have any questions about the steps that are written out here as well? So I think that using the last method to come up with the groups is a good idea. So if we could count from 1 to 4, and then the 1s and the 2s and the 3s and the 4s can disperse in the 2 spaces we have. So let's start with Robert. 2, 3,
4, 1.
2, 4, 1, 2, 3. Wonderful. So then there are going to be some groups with 3 people and some with 4. So it's 11:15. Maybe so. What were Hardin's key ideas, and what did you think were the strengths and weaknesses of this article? And also, what do you think of the article itself as a something that was published in Science magazine? So key arguments. Do you think this is a good example of a neo-Malthusian take on environmental issues? Why? That would bring about some of his key arguments.
He argues for slowing the population.
Excuse me?
He argues for the slowing of the population.
So too many people are the problem, so we have to do something about it. And what are some of the ways in which he sort of argues something should be done about the population problem?
I think one of his arguments was it was the UN human rights declaration of how a family is like very foundational, that it can be whatever you want it to be, and that he said it's basically saying like that's like we need to go against that and remove that.
So he objected to the fundamental human right to breed. So
Yeah.
he was really fixated on freedom to breed being unacceptable given the circumstances, right? Which is environmental degradation and so forth. Others?
You mentioned that
so there was a very clear imprint of Thomas Malthus's ideas right there, right? So if each family had to be responsible to feed their children, then there would be an automatic correction on how many children they would have. But if there was a welfare state, then there would be an incentive to have the maximum number of children to get the maximum number of welfare benefits. So I guess, so then his key ideas are, he's really observing environmental degradation in ways that I think we can relate to, concern about, the fisheries demise and all of that. But then he seems to be putting all of that on the idea that, there's too many people and therefore we have to take away those freedoms for the greater good. So key arguments are there. What about strengths and weaknesses of the arguments and claims? Beyond making that main argument, the article is all over the place and he makes a lot of little arguments as well. So maybe there were some things that resonated and then some things that, maybe didn't seem as compelling.
I feel like he made a lot of good points and he had a lot of good examples, but I kind of lost a little bit of trust or kind of like, it was like a little goofy almost when he brought up the free parking being like destructive and like he also mentioned the music playing as like infringing on personal rights because it was like obnoxious and kind of equating it to strange things that don't quite fit together. It was just a little, I guess, out there, not quite, didn't quite equivalate the same weight of problems, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know what term there is for this kind of reasoning. I think that he was using a certain kind of logical reasoning. I think one might say that he was applying like inductive reasoning, taking a number of disparate observations and then forming a conclusion. And then we are trying to assess to what extent the conclusion drawn from these disparate observations were, warranted, right? Other thoughts on, little claims here and there that made or didn't make sense?
I feel it wasn't too scientific. He said something towards the end about how doing nothing is still doing something because doing nothing produces evils, but didn't elaborate on what producing evils mean, and that kind of sounds like just like an opinion.
Yeah, I think I remember coming across that, but the style of writing certainly is quite unusual for today. And I think like Kyra was talking about, I think the individual author's very personal taste in music or various things were there, and it was a little bit, maybe not squarely focused on the argument itself. And then personally, I didn't understand the tic-tac-toe, that reference.
That was, it was funny to read,
It was
but
fun.
it was just so out there, like there just wasn't, I feel like there wasn't really a good meaning with it. I think you could use a better reference to explain it.
I think sometimes I noticed this throughout the article, like just the tone and the way he would write, it just sometimes, it felt like a little like aggrandizing, like he was kind of more declaring something in a speech, like broadcasting to a crowd rather than like an academic paper.
Yeah.
So, very flawed sort of writing style and argumentation. Typically in academic writing, we like to emphasize that a good essay or paper is based on many claims, evidence-based claims, and then based on the claims you make a key argument. And it sounds like what I'm hearing is that there's not a very well-organized argument based on a series of claims. But maybe there are some, maybe there are certain things that were valuable, pieces of claims and sort of reasoning that were valuable. We know that this has been a very influential article, and so maybe we can think of some of the ways in which there are some sensible or reasonable arguments being made in light of the sort of ecological crisis that he talks about. For instance, I think in the first page, something that I could relate to was the idea that not all solutions come from the natural sciences. I thought, yeah, that's right. I mean, as a social scientist, I think that not much. It seems like it's an uphill battle to say that some of the solutions come from the social sciences as well. So some of those kinds of assertions seem to be reasonable, and then we didn't really build on sort of some of these assertions in a sort of organized sort of way. But Iris, please go ahead.
I did like the quote where he talks about, it tied into the quote I mentioned last seminar as well. He states that the laws of our society follow the pattern of ancient ethics and therefore are poorly suited to governing a complex, crowded, changeable world. And I feel like that applies to his statement of conscience. Just like we're no longer in the same state we used to be, so like we're not taking account for the changes that are currently happening, like in our environment, yet our economy and like our factories are still producing things at that rate, which shouldn't be as much. But
So reminding people that the circumstances are, I think what he was speaking to some of the moral rules there are, like not stealing, things of that nature, were there for, so we need a newer set of rules. What do people think about the idea of mutual coercion? So I think building up on Iris's idea, the idea that we need new kinds of, we need to agree that we can't just do whatever we want. So the idea of challenging the idea of unlimited freedom, as if there are no consequences, seems to be a reasonable invitation to show restraint. I think in one of the breakout groups there was a conversation happening about the idea of coercion and how he was trying to put a positive spin on it. Are there any thoughts on maybe just the idea of mutual coercion and just the idea of needing more restraint because of changing circumstances?
In my opinion, coercion has a very negative, has a very negative connotation. So, I don't know exactly how he meant it to be used to sort of,
Change the definition. He was trying to change the definition, and it didn't quite work out like the way he was trying to talk about it and trying to, I guess, change that definition. It didn't really make sense.
It's almost as if you're trying to use a word like propaganda and use it in a positive way. When I read it, I didn't read it that way, but since I'm hearing it like this, it seems as if he could have maybe used a better choice of words, and I would think that about his choice of the word commons. Also, good idea, but then maybe using the wrong word that led to a lot of counter arguments. I think Ben and Tara.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, it kind of, for me, it kind of depends on how much coercion. Like, you can still have, like, lots of really good freedoms, but a little bit of coercion. Like, if we are going to use that word, manners would be an example of that. You have, you have to say please, thank you, but that is coercion. But it's like, it's kind of a good type, or not, screaming bomb at an airport or whatever,
Yeah, it seems like some kind of constraint on behavior, right? Limitations, so that you can't just do whatever you want all the time. So what's the accurate term for that? Seems to be what we're talking about.
Yeah, I feel like he definitely had a few examples for the coercion kind of idea and trying to explain how he defined it. That worked out well, like the quote where he was talking about the 150 years ago, a plainsman could kill an American bison, cut out only the tongue for his dinner, and discard the rest of the animal. He was not in any important sense being wasteful. Today, with only a few thousand bison left, we'd be appalled at such behavior. So like, you know, or the other one where it's the freedom of the seas and treating it out as an inexhaustible resource while they're, you know, killing and hurting thousands of different species to ruin potentially. That makes sense, and I feel like his, you know, it's understandable, you know, something needs to be done in those situations. But I feel like his use of other examples, such as like the other goofy examples I brought up earlier, were kind of made it weird and kind of bad taste in your mouth, I guess. Kind of muddied the waters, I suppose. He almost used too many different examples to relate it to the reader, I feel.
And this particular quote, I marked it, and the comment I wrote was, 150 years ago, a plainsman could kill an American bison, cut out only the tongue for his dinner, and discard the rest of the animal. He was not in any important sense being wasteful. I marked this and said, this is a perfect quote to reveal his ethnocentricity, right? He's really coming from a very specific cultural position, and today, like Native American, you know, scholars and thinkers that have interest in environmental studies say that the sort of Native American indigenous worldview is not compatible with this way of killing a bison and only taking parts of it, right? All of the parts would be used. So already there's I think it just indicates that he's coming from a very cultural, specific cultural context, and maybe some of the arguments he's making make sense within that cultural context, but then imposing it everywhere maybe has been part of the problem.
Yeah, he has a very westernized, capitalistic view on people, and I think that definitely shows very brightly with his examples and his writing.
Nate and then.
I thought some of his language and how he put forward some of these ideas and situations, it was rather unclear if he was just drawing on it for reference or if it was like, if he supported it or not because of how he spoke. And then he was saying about how it kept changing so much. Because at the end, there was something said about how, looking back on what they had just said, that humankind was so complicated on this stuff that the answer wasn't going to be so straightforward. So then I wonder if his intent was not, I don't know how to say that.
Provocative, or
Maybe like if his intent was actually maybe in the right vision in his mind of the language of it because of his culture. And then I also felt like unclear, like I said, that if he believed some of this stuff or not, if he was just saying that this is what he's been observed or said.
Yeah, it seems as if maybe he's not really making a very methodical argument, maybe just randomly throwing out references, but they were not really working to build his claims in a methodical way, right? So it's hard. You're saying that it's hard to tell how seriously he's mentioning these things.
And what his like final point was, even though like he had some points.
And
Oh, my question was answered.
so, Gerard, do you have some thoughts on the scientific credibility of this argument?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll present I did listen to all of you, you know, as you were seeing this in retrospect and you're reading kind of for later on, I like so. But the first thing I thought of asking you is maybe to try to, I mean, this was something very influential, and when I started doing environmental studies, we saw it all the time, because the starting point for environmental studies, examination, right? So maybe one question that I'd like to ask you is, why do you think it was so influential, given all the things you brought up, right now? Is it something about the times it was published? Okay. And I'm going to ask more about the reference, right? So I'll say something about it. So yeah, Gary Hardin is pretty well known, but he's an ecologist, and Science magazine is a very influential magazine. So, and all science is really diverse. There's tons of different sciences, but there's 2 journals in the world that are the most prestigious in reporting science. One's called Science, it's based in Washington D.C., and the other one's called Nature, and Nature is based in London. Okay. There's 2. Right, okay, so what the science and nature journals are supposed to do? Their role is to publish the cutting edge information in science. So it's super prestigious to publish there because all the fields try to get published there because everybody reads science and nature, regardless of what field you are in. So get publishing in nature is super prestigious, but to publish there has to be cutting edge, has to be totally new, that all of science is considered. Okay. So in science there's different articles. There's articles that are called the research articles, which are data-based, and there's some kind of editorials and reviews. Okay, so this is more of I would not consider this to be the data articles are the traditional articles that represent nature and science. So then you wonder, why did the editors decide to publish this, right? Okay. So why would I say they published it? And that's why actually the context of the time. First, is very, very important person, right? And it's addressing, from a scientific perspective, this global problem which is interdisciplinary. So on the one hand, I think there is some weight to his credibility because he's an important scientist, so they gave him this opportunity. But I agree with some of the things that we're talking about. He's basically outside his field. He's not talking about his field expertise. But you would argue that in our society with huge problems, as scientists, we have the responsibility to voice our opinion, right? And there's this tricky thing about, some scientists will say, and you guys are really insightful, you say, in science, you use data and then you use inference, and here the data is just different examples, right? So you could argue, I can find a counterexample, but that could also be the data. So how do you evaluate which example is better, right? So you guys could argue that, right? But I think the value of it is, in the time it was published, started to face this huge problems, huge environmental, at a scale that have not been maybe seen before, pollution at planetary scale, and there is this remnant of the Malthusian to say an important aspect of this problem is population. And I must admit, as a scientist, it's very attractive to talk about the Malthusian point of view because in nature, in science, you always talk about limits, physical limits. The world is physically limited, right? So ultimately, you could argue the pollution keeps increasing, and ultimately it's going to reach a limit, right? So there's a physical reality to that. But it comes into counterpoint with the ability to recognize that depending on choice of the populations, there's different numbers that will reach that limit. And that's where the crucial problem is, when do we decide what number is the carrying capacity? And that's more about things of value. So I go back to the first thing at the top, it says, the pollution problem has no technical solution. It requires a fundamental extension in morality. So I think one of the contributions is saying that there is some physical limits, and it's pointing to the idea that it's basically values that alter behavior that decides where the balance is between the human need and the physical limit, right? I think that as a scientist, I think it does extend, science usually are going to say, we talk about solutions, but we're not trained to, or science is not supposed to give you, it isn't supposed to solve problems of value. It's just like I can tell you how important salmon is, but it's up to you to decide. Well, we will protect salmon, or we don't care about that. We'll protect, mud snails instead. Right? And it's a long answer to the question, but.
So I think it seems to me, I think what you said about he has a lot of credibility as a scientist, but then he was writing about something, so that let him get space in this journal. But it seems to me that this particular article is a clumsy attempt on his part to comment on how society works, right? And so that it seems like he was just adding a little bit of morality, literature, and philosophy, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and then using his broad observations to make conclusions. So the argument itself was not scientific or based on a methodical analysis of data collected in a particular way, but based on, having said that, it is really striking that it went on to become so popular, which I think we're noting some of the ways in which his use of language could, leave room to be desired, it could be improved, more accurate use of terminology. But on the other hand, it seems like he really used some phrase, the idea of the tragedy of commons has been so attractive as a metaphor. Despite the flaws of the article, it seems like he was very clever in articulating the title, and so most people probably don't remember the little details of a lot of the detail in the article, but the idea that something commonly owned, commonly accessible resources are meeting this tragic end, and we have to do something about it. It seems like that idea seems to have a lot of purchase, and so it seems like this article is influential in spite of itself, not because of the way in which, so it really conjured up a really a very effective metaphor to remind people that we have to do things differently.
Okay, so why do you think it was so influential? What do you think of the things that it says would attract people that are in governments and people? What?
I don't know where I'm gonna go with my statement, but I know, today there's people out here that don't believe in science. I've heard claims that are oh, it's science, oh, this isn't real, but it's this is the most advanced knowledge that we have today. And from our, for example, our country leaning towards Western roots of colonialism, we've leaned away from oral traditions and knowledge that has been passed down, for example, to indigenous peoples. And all of their knowledge was passed down through stories, just examples, or through their own personal experiences. And those have had such an important role into why they've lived for so long. And I feel this is an example of the author trying to bring that in and tie it into the scientific knowledge of it, but also trying to persuade the reader into okay, I'm not just giving you the facts, I'm giving you examples and reasoning and experiences and stories that can help you visualize what is happening and what I'm trying to explain. So I think it's tying into the storytelling, which is why there's so many examples that I really liked, and for some people maybe there's a lot of big vocabulary, so I think the specific examples, even though they have different opinions to them, I think it helps the reader understand what the author's trying to display. Just mixing both of them in, yeah.
And I think Maeve had your hand up. Keep going. Sorry,
it's okay,
Chelsea.
Also during the time period, looking at 1968, this period in America was a time where people were starting to adopt wildly different ideas, thought processes coming from Berkeley and other universities in the country. And some people, I feel maybe were craving something new and different that they hadn't heard. And maybe to some this may have been new and different. Whether it was right or wrong, may have been an attractant to it, that regardless of how it was structured or how scholarly it looked, that people may have kind of run with that.
And I think Eve had your hand up, and then Sarah.
I think that maybe one of the reasons why it became so popular and gained so much traction is that even though if you're reading this from a kind of a scientific view, it seems kind of random, and a lot of the things he says doesn't seem they're really influential really at all. But he's putting in all these examples that everyone understands, even those who are not interested in this field. It's the tic-tac-toe reference, the parking meters, the songs playing in the store. They don't really connect at all to what he's getting at, but it pulls the reader in because it's oh wait, it's something I know.
Yeah.
Therefore, maybe I can take into account everything else he's saying and put it in that way of thinking.
Yeah.
So if I read this without those in it, it would seem a little more scientifically strong, but it wouldn't have felt as relatable, even though it would seem a little silly at times.
was being put out in this style of, like connecting morality to the use of natural resources when out in the world in this style. So I think that has I think it depends on how popular it got. Yeah, I just think maybe this was like the first, or one of the first like connections between the two. People were starting to think about the effect of humans on the world.
I think the 1960s was a time when, 50s and 60s in the United States was a time when there was like an environmental awakening. Aldo Leopold wrote the Sand Almanac, he brought up the idea of the land ethic. I think that was also another moment where ideas of ethics was starting to be introduced to questions of environmental damage. But yeah, it seems like maybe, I guess this is an early example of interdisciplinary work, right? In terms of, scientists trying to do work outside of their immediate realm. And Paul Ehrlich also was publishing at this time, and he was also extending his work on biology, on butterfly populations. That was the focus of his study, and using that, studying butterfly populations to then extrapolate that idea on the, ebbs and flows of the human population. And so sometimes when you cross these boundaries, there's bound to be some, adjustments need to be made. But I think this is a good segue to talk then about the Ostrom piece, which is using, I think, a scientific methodology to study society. And so, as a counter-argument to trying to correct some of the arguments that Hardin was making here, and also for context, 10 years later, Hardin published another article in response to the tremendous amount of backlash, and he published a corrected version of this article saying, he said it was a tragedy of the commons, but what he meant was the tragedy of open access resources. Commons is different from open access resources because in the commons, there's actually a set of rules and regulations people come up with, and that's the subject of the Ostrom piece. So why don't we go back to the same groups and have a brief discussion, a somewhat briefer discussion than what you had for the Hardin piece, and just bring up maybe this, think about ways in which Ostrom's article, the excerpts that you read, to what extent are there sort of effective counter-arguments made to Hardin's ideas on the commons, but also be thinking about, we can come back and have a broader discussion of what's the value of this critique and what are its limitations. Does it apply everywhere? So we can think about whether the kinds of studies that Ostrom has done on communities around the world, to what extent is that applicable to what we recognize, in the U.S. context. So think about Ostrom's arguments and its limits as well. So let's take 20 minutes to have this discussion, and we can come back. If you need a break, you can take it first. And our social scientists who use more qualitative methodology, who don't work with numbers and statistics and that kind of quantitative data, but work with meaning, words and interpretations and things of that nature. But scientifically oriented social scientist, and she did work in economics and political science. So what are the key arguments that come out of this article, of which you read some excerpts? How did she counter the idea of the tragic commons?
She used a lot of research-based, a lot of pieces from research and experiments and stuff, and she drew a lot on that. I really like the example of the farming, or the data from the farming and irrigation, that the farmer run in general were better in both output and kind of sustainability and all that good stuff.
So she collected some data, and she was not just collecting data, but doing some meta-analysis of many studies, right? So trying to produce some generalizable results and finding that people are not always a problem. People can also, come up with ways to negate the tragedies, right? So that kind of empirical studies. So what other things came out in the article that sort of countered some of the argument made by Hardin about the tragedy of the commons? There are examples about irrigation and farming systems where people-managed systems were working as effectively, if not more, than the government-managed systems. Any other examples come to mind?
I just mentioned sort of the mentality that a lot of people view sort of society as having, as being unable to change the structures that we're sort of finding them, or sort of unable to be responsible for the resources that they use.
You mentioned the prisoner's dilemma. So does you or anyone else want to describe what was meant there? So the prisoner's dilemma is oftentimes used as a metaphorical or game theory experiment where sort of people are kept from being able to communicate with one another, and when they're grilled and quizzed and asked to respond to questions, each set of individuals tries to protect their own interests, and then if they had been able to communicate with one another, maybe both of their interests would have been met. But when they're not able to communicate with one another, in a classic prison, sort of scenario, like two people have committed a crime, and if they tell on the other, they get a reduced sentence, but then the other person gets an increased sentence. But if they were both able to communicate with one another and make a plan that neither of us is going to rat on the other, then both of them get reduced sentences. So that is a very commonly used experiment to explain the tragedy of the commons like dilemmas. And in the tragedy of the commons, the basher dilemma, the idea of free rider comes up as well, which is similar. If there are no, the idea of the free rider is that when there are rules dictating how much of resources can or cannot be used, free riders are those that think, oh, if I'm the only one who's not following the rules, I use more than I should, it's not going to affect anyone else. And so I guess it's a similar kind of thing as the prisoner's dilemma, in that it creates a disincentive to collaborate with others or coordinate with others. But so what you're saying is that Ostrom's research reveals that the prisoner's dilemma, like selfish behavior, isn't always seen in the real world, where people do cooperate with one another and for better sort of ends. So then, any other thoughts on Ostrom's research?
On the note of the prisoner's dilemma, they also brought up a good research paper that outlined the differences between differences in kind of reliability of the users and reporting different things, and to follow the rules when they were allowed to communicate versus not allowed to communicate. When they weren't allowed to communicate and talk to each other and kind of have, I guess, develop almost a loyalty or friendships with each other, they took more than they were supposed to. It was less likely for offenders to be caught taking too much or destroying things. Which I think is important because choose a couple different things like that to illustrate that people are far more willing to work together than people have historically thought.
Anastasia.
I just had a question, like if you could elaborate more on what the grim trigger is, because it kind of has to go with the prisoner's dilemma. It says it's like a single defection that brings an end to the cooperation, but I was just kind of confused on what that
Can you
meant.
say what page number it's on?
Possibly.
From what I know, it's like when it's like the retaliation of other users. So one user is like, I'm gonna take more than I need, than I should. And another user might be like, well, they're not getting punished, so I might as well be doing it as well. And it's kind of like a domino effect of that, I think.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly coming across that section, but what you described, did you say group trigger effect?
Grim trigger, like the Grim Reaper.
I ended up looking
What you said, what you referred to seems to be, yeah, like a disincentive to follow the rules. When somebody breaks the rules and they're not, or there are no consequences, I didn't want to say punished, but when there are no consequences, there is an incentive to not follow the rules, but I don't know if that.
It's on page 650 in the middle chunk.
650. In the middle?
In the middle paragraph, towards the bottom of the paragraph.
Oh.
Which one is
I don't see it.
Where is it? What's up? How does it start?
Page 650 on the
Oh,
third paragraph
oh,
down,
I see.
right under the little italics. It's gonna be at the very last sentence, it talks about the Grim trigger.
Oh, I see.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I don't remember seeing it. Yeah, I don't, I would have to look at that article to see how it was described. With this mention, it's not very clear to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just saying that they didn't find any cases that the harvesters used the Grim trigger effect. They didn't explain it. I ended up looking it up and just reading what it was. And that's my explanation is kind of the gist of what I found.
Your explanation makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just saying that a lot of theoretical arguments for how the individuals would solve the repeated, dilemmas and that they didn't find any evidence of it. And so theoretical, yes, this could happen, but in our research, it wasn't happening.
So, what I sort of am getting out of reading this paragraph is that there are communities with resource management structures, and sometimes like a tragedy-like scenario can be avoided by enacting some really stringent punishment. It seems to me, not having read this article by Dutta, it seems to me that the group trigger strategy is a more extreme form of punishment, but that in the case studies that were reviewed, people didn't have to use a very extreme punishment. That even like self-enforcing mechanisms were working effectively enough to not take extreme measures. That people were collaborating with one another, effectively enough. And so that is quite compatible with, a lot of the research that Ostrom has done and reviewed here. That shows that not in all cases, but in many cases where resources are sustainably managed, that there seems to be an existence of a suite of rules and regulations that people came up with themselves, not an external agency, but resource users themselves, based on need, came up with need and historical, maybe ancestral knowledge. They had the sense to, self-govern themselves by placing limits on how much they could take. I mean, in indigenous studies in the United States, there's a saying, for instance, that the Anishinaabe people have a philosophy of not taking more than they need and leaving enough for 7 generations. There are things of that nature, right? So this is more drawing on more traditional, this is a traditional resource management scheme. So what Ostrom and others like her have done is to look at how, so there's an idea that there's a tragedy of the commons, but that has not been seen everywhere. There are many communities around the world where resource use has been sustainable. So what Ostrom and others have done is to go and look at communities where resources have been used sustainably and try to figure out why. What has been done that has worked, and based on a lot of study, they came up with these so-called design principles, like 8 characteristics that are typically seen in communities where there is sustainable resource use. And so the key seems to be that resource use is not devoid of rules and regulations, that there are rules. That's the key distinction between when something is an open access resources where anything goes, and that's the kind of environment that Hardin was saying we shouldn't, that's what leads to a tragedy. And in most cases in the commons, it's not anything goes. So I think we wanted to also talk about, I think it's very clear that she's really making a very forceful argument based on empirical data that tragedy of the commons doesn't always take place, but we can also think about maybe the limitations of, can all kinds of environmental problems be resolved by following Ostrom's strategy, or Ostrom's work is really advocating for people-based governance, more bottom-up governance, and what are instances where maybe that is not adequate, or if we take specific environmental challenges, we're in the class studying about climate change. When we look at climate change, does the kind of common pool resource governance, does that work or has it worked? Those are some questions we can ask to apply the tragedy of the commons framework to climate change. Any other thoughts?
I thought it was really important. The last kind of paragraph talks about accepting complexity in the situation, and the complexity around solving the situations as opposed to rejecting it. And I think that that's really important. She also makes a good point earlier in the article that, in her opinion, one of the issues is when top-down government kind of regulations they tend to put local officials and users in the dark and kind of don't explain things. So yeah, that's just something.
So for example, if you think about a big forest, if there's I think she's making an argument against a very hyper-centralized form of governance, right? Where, for instance, there's a forest and there's a forest manager, maybe a federal or state level manager, and forest territory can be thousands of acres. And if there's a centralized authority who has to monitor whether or not certain rules are being followed, rules meaning what you can or cannot harvest, that just from a very logistical point of view as well, it becomes harder to enforce when one person or one small group of people are supposed to monitor things in vast territories. Whereas if it's decentralized, people who are dependent on the resource, if they have the authority to self-regulate themselves, there's an expression, more eyes on the street. So if the people are regulating their own behavior and that of their neighbors, it just makes it a little bit easier in that sense as well. So maybe that's what.
Yeah, and I feel like it's important to note that I don't think they were explicitly saying, governing, top-down government isn't bad.
Mm-hmm.
It has problems with how this has historically been implemented. Yeah, that's just kind of what I felt.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So Ostrom doesn't say that top-down governance is a bad thing. Rather that we can also sometimes, in some cases, trust the people on the ground to govern themselves. And in fact, she makes an argument specifically about polycentric governance, which is not the same thing as decentralized governance. Decentralized means there should be no center. Everything should be governed by grassroots groups, right? But polycentric means there should be a center, because there's value in having experts and people who have the resources to do, collect research and do the, calculations, monitoring, etc. So people who need to develop expertise and then do larger scale studies to inform what must happen in the local context. But then people at the center working in tandem with people at multiple decentralized centers. So that seems like an oxymoron, decentralized centers, but that has been a big, part of her advocacy, that there should be centralized authorities working in tandem with communities that are better situated to, self-govern. But she does not make an argument for anarchy and that there should be no government and everybody should just, control their own affairs. It's not the kind of argument. So she's not that radical of a scholar. Did anyone think of any sort of limitations of the whether it's decentralized or polycentric?
Not really. I think just a general limitation of the article that Ostrom wrote. It's very academic. So for like someone with more of just like basic level knowledge, it's a little inaccessible.
So that's true. So and it's also using very like game theory references. We actually have not studied anything about the commons, so it's a little sudden too. So yeah, it's very technical as well, using jargon. And I guess it's harder to read dry academic prose. I think earlier we heard about how some of the stylistic flourishes in the Hardin article made it more interesting to read. So I think there's that piece as well. But I thought, so we had a good discussion, but better discussion of the Hardin article than that of Ostrom. But it sort of makes sense that we were sort of trying to understand, unpack the idea of new Malthusian thinking. So we'll have time to return to the sort of commons discussion in week 3. But I think we're coming to an end, and so I think both of us tried to facilitate discussion in specific ways and giving various, using various strategies. We used breakout group discussion, all class discussion. Today I didn't really ask people to do a round robin. Sometimes it's nice to do a round robin to hear what everybody else has said. So I think next week and onwards we have a plan for who's going to facilitate.
Yeah, it's Sophie and Ben. Sophie and Ben. Okay. So you can meet with us Tuesday after lecture, and we can kind of help you. But your task to then is you start reading the book, and then maybe get some ideas of what you think is interesting in the book to discuss. So you can be a little filter. But also think about what we did the last 2 seminars, and your task is to make sure everybody participates. So that's a good way to do it. So think about that, and we can go over your time.
Do we need to bring anything for the lab, or what do we need to bring for the?
Oh, for tomorrow?
Yeah.
Okay. So tomorrow, bring something to write. You get up. You start with kind of mini lecture. So essentially, you get in a doc, you'll get a little mini lecture, put everything in context. Then you form groups, and your team, whoever your team is, will do some measurements with instruments I showed you in lab in the dock, and then you take turns getting on the boat. And once that is done, you go home. So the important thing is to bring you something to write, maybe lunch at the farmers market's closed. There's a lot of little stores there, you can get coffee and stuff. Oh, the farmers market's closed. There's a bathroom there, but it's probably closed. So the closest bathroom is Bathos and Bronson's little coffee shop there, by the farmers market that's open, so there's a bathroom there. It's an important thing to know. Okay. So basically that's it. You're going to be outside for 3 hours. So
And it seems like it's going to be raining. So.
No.
Oh,
I hope it's not.
I thought I was going to say bring your raincoat.
Well, bring your raincoats. Yeah. If you don't know, it will rain. So be prepared for cold weather. Okay. But the forecast indicates it's a model. Because the model is going wrong.
That's right. So I won't be there tomorrow, but Friday we're going to meet in E1107, like last week, and I will give a handout for the UN negotiations exercise. But remember, we're also going to finalize research teams. So be thinking about your research interest for this class. And during your field trip and your excursion, you can also talk to one another, and maybe if you had some ideas as to working together with certain people, maybe use the opportunity tomorrow as well to do that. And on Friday we'll finalize things.
So when are we supposed to have, we're supposed to be up to 115?
113, I think, is happening.
113, okay, and then, when is?
By next Friday then.
By next Friday, I'm gonna sign it, so the seminar won't occur until Friday,
Okay,
and then so the essay won't be able to.
and then, so yeah, the essay will be due on Friday before seminar? Okay.
And the other people who are doing quotes, they also have to turn in their quotes in some
Yeah.
space. You'll see the link on Canvas also by Friday.
So obviously, everybody has to read it, right? Just the way you're participating is other. So there's another question?
If anyone wants a ride to the site tomorrow,
Yeah,
I'll
I'm
be
actually
driving.
see too.
I have lots of seats as well.
So why don't you communicate? There's two people that have seats, so whoever wants to ride, why don't you stay a little bit and coordinate?
You want to have a leaving, sort of jumping off point, or where you're going to leave from?
I'm leaving from the apartment complex right next to the school, and then I swing by the dorms or the mods or kind of that whole area.
Yeah.
Do you want to set up a time when you're going to be in that area?
Yeah, I don't have a time set up exactly.
When would you have to be there?
9.
9?
10 minutes before.
Hoping to meet at 8:30 in the loop by the dorms, so.
Does anyone know how to use Discord or have used Discord?
I have it on my phone.
I do. Because I can try to make one and I can put it in the discussions so we can all like communicate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be great.
That's a good idea.
So you can.
And Ben, did you have a question or?
Oh, I was just gonna ask, is all the information for the seminar, gonna be on Canvas? Or
It's
next
already on the
week's?
syllabus.
Okay,
It's already in the syllabus. But the,
Yeah,
where
the
you
one
turn in your essays, yeah, the rotation grid will be on there in the main module at the very top, before the weekly modules.
okay.
Yeah, I have the information now, so I'll enter it and I'll post it so you know what's going on each month. But you should know what's going on next week already, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And whether it's an essay or anything else, quotes, you'll be submitting it on Canvas. It
Okay.
will be, so you'll see a to-do link that pops up for you.
And the essay will be due before Friday.
Yeah.
That's right. Next week before Friday, typical weeks before Wednesday.